Welcome back to Scaling Theory. Today, we are taking on a surprising but deeply relevant topic: religion. We are not entering the realm of theology, but rather looking at religion the way an economist may look at a multinational corporation or a digital platform. Think of it this way. In the US alone, faith-based organizations generates more annual revenue than Apple and Microsoft combined. So when we ask about how religions scale, we are really asking how some of the world's most enduring and powerful institutions grow, adapt, and persist. My guest is Paul Seabright, professor of economics at the Toulouse School of Economics and author of The Divine Economy: How Religions Compete for Wealth, Power, and People. Paul and I talk about how religions scale and why rituals, doctrines, and competing narratives matter for growth. We explore how religions act as multi-sided platforms, how they build robust networks that resist time, and how technologies like the printing press and social media can reshape their reach. Towards the end of our conversation, we explore whether new movements in the Silicon Valley function like new religions and what their chances of success might be in today's competitive market for belief. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. Paul, thank you so very much for coming on the podcast. As will become very apparent in just a second, we know each other pretty well. So this is going to be a friendly conversation about a very important subject. And before we start, I have two disclaimers. The first one is that the book is divided in two main parts. One about how religions gain power, and the second one about how they exploit that power. Now, because this podcast is called Scaling Theory, I will focus for the most part on the gaining power part of the book. The second disclaimer is this. When we talk about religion, and this is what we're going to do today, we are talking about big businesses. This is a point that you make in the book, and I'm going to quote you already. A study published in 2016 estimated that faith-based organizations in the US only received revenues equal to $378 billion US dollars, which, to put in perspective, is greater than the revenues in the same year of Apple and Microsoft combined. And it's also 60% of the revenues of the media and entertainment industries, which includes films, gaming, books, and music. So indeed, that gives some perspective about the importance of the subject. With this in mind, I think we can get started. But before we do, I want to ask, what is the main passion of yours outside of your work? And do you feel that it may have some influence on your academic endeavors and most specifically on that book?
I'm passionate about travel. I've traveled since I was very small, and I just love going to new places. I love traveling with friends or with family, but traveling alone is a special excitement. I will go and sit in a cafe or a restaurant and pretend I'm not listening to the people around me, but I'm soaking it all up. That is a very big passion, and I hope to go on doing it as long as I have the physical strength.
And in the book, I was actually surprised quite a few times when now he's in Ghana or now he's all over the world. So this somehow served you while writing the book, right?
Oh yeah, there are a lot of episodes that I report from my own experience. One of the ways in which I discovered in writing earlier books to make a problem vivid was to take a scene and say, this is what's happening in this scene, and then say, in this chapter, we want to try and understand what's going on in the scene. And so often what I'll do is I'll start the chapter with a scene, and by the end of the chapter, I come back and refer again to the scene and say, now we've been through the basic principles, the basic arguments, can we have a better sense of what's going on in the scene before us? It's not always as ponderously didactic as that, but that's often the way I organize, the way I take a set of ideas. I would say that there's a difference between a certain Anglo-Saxon way of doing economics and a certain French way of doing economics, which I see a lot in my discussions with my colleagues, which is that the French version is very Cartesian and very axiomatic. So you start by making a set of assumptions about how an economy must behave, and then you follow it through to a set of propositions. Whereas I think the Anglo-Saxon approach is more empiricist and pragmatic. That's to say, you look at a situation and you say, can we understand what's happening? Can we reverse engineer the motives that people had in behaving in this way? And so my approach in the book is very Anglo-Saxon. I look at a scene, or I look at a predicament, or I look at a problem, or I look at a situation, or even a set of statistics, and I say, what is going on here? Can we reverse engineer it?
Yeah. And I think it's in the introduction where you tell the story of that woman, and then you say, look, she's actually quite poor, and yet she gives 10% of her revenues pretty much to the church. How come? Knowing that the person in charge of that church is knowingly wealthy. And something that I actually appreciated a lot is that in the conclusion, you actually do say, those are all the questions that I will promise you I'll give an answer to in the introduction. And so here they are. And then you go back to all of those questions and provide the clear answer to those. I enjoyed that experience very much. All right, on that, I've divided my questions in 3 different parts. First, I want to talk about how to create a religion, or in a more academic way, how they have been created. Then I want to talk about the scaling of religions. And then in part 3, I would like to take you a bit outside of the comfort zone of the book and see if we can extrapolate from the book or if it's not feasible. Part 1, the creating of a religion. You suggest, and for the people who have a copy of the book already, this is in page 32, that when societies scale, religion tends to follow. And so I want to talk about that, the common traits behind the creation of successful religions. And I'd like to start with you giving us a quick overview of some of the traits in those successful religions. And here specifically starting with the rituals. How important are they, and what do they tend to have in common?
Okay, rituals are very important, but they're very diverse. And in fact, that's a general point I'd like to make about the religious movements I described. Obviously, religious movements are not exactly the same as secular businesses, although I point out that they are businesses. They are united by being based around a set of interactions, as the participants perceive it, with invisible spirits who act causally in the world and who are susceptible to our entreaties and our interrogations, if we can phrase those right. Now, that seems to make religions a rather small subset of all human activities, but in fact, they're immensely diverse. So the kinds of things people do in their interactions with these invisible spirits are extraordinarily varied. So it can be anything from private prayer and meditation in a fairly solitary way. So think of a Zen Buddhist monk at the dawn as the sun comes up meditating. It can be mass pilgrimages, like the very big one that happened in India earlier this year, in which literally hundreds of millions of people converged on a place and took part in these mass open air ceremonies. It can be violent activity. We have to face it. A lot of religious activity has been historically, and still sometimes is, violent. It's bringing together people in some violent pursuit of a goal. Sometimes it's altruistic and loving. It's working to provide for the poor and the suffering. Sometimes it's joyous. It can be engaging in shared musical activity. Sometimes it is quietly, collectively meditative. So in other words, there's no single textbook type of activity that the religions do in their collective celebration of their interaction with perceived invisible spirits. But several things to emphasize. One is it is collective. Even the Buddhist monk meditating at dawn is doing so conscious of a tradition in which that meditation makes sense. I don't think it makes sense to suppose somebody could make up a religion which is entirely personal to them, has no other followers. That wouldn't make sense. I wouldn't call that a religion. But it's quite possible to be a solo meditator because what you do is conscious of the tradition within which you're meditating. So the ritual matters, but the rituals can be very different. So I've attended, for example, Quaker services, which seem to be the antithesis of ritual because they're very simple, that people just sit quietly together. And wait until one of them is moved to speak. I even once attended a Quaker wedding where nobody was moved to speak during the entire wedding. Those of us who weren't familiar with Quaker rituals found that rather embarrassing. But I think the Quakers themselves were quite cool with it, because sometimes that happens. You can spend the entire service, nobody is moved to speak. That's okay. But the ritual is the fact that there is no formal giving of orders as to who does what. The ritual is precisely the fact that you all sit and wait for something to happen. And even if something doesn't happen, that is itself a ritual. But of course, sometimes the ritual is amazingly complex. So as we speak, there's a papal conclave going on. And of course, people are writing about this ritual in fascination. There was a movie made about it recently. It's bells and smells, the lot. Once again, the ritual can be very varied. I make it very clear in the book that there is ritual in secular organizations as well. Political parties have their rituals. Economics departments have their rituals. We have a certain way in which we hold our seminars and so forth. Podcasts have their rituals, for that matter. So it's not rituals that make the activities religious. What makes them religious is this implied presence of invisible spirits, whether they're thought of as very present to us or whether they're somewhat distant and abstract. But the rituals are what demarcate one particular movement from another. It's because you do these rituals that you belong to this movement and not some other movement.
I actually thought, talking about the movie and your book, that it was extremely timely. And then I realized there is always something that will make it timely, right, when it comes to religions.
Yeah.
So, okay, so rituals may have some common characteristics, including the fact that they involve like a bunch of people, but it's not that there is only just one way of doing those rituals that will be common to all of the religions. Is it the same when it comes to doctrines? Do you see that they have some common traits? You explain in the book that you have to have doctrines in a way that people are willing to accept them, but it's not that they have already to believe in them in order to join a religious movement. But still, are there some common traits, or do we see also a lot of diversity?
Huge amount of diversity. I would say there are some religious movements that basically have virtually no doctrines at all, except the doctrine that this is the ritual you have to follow. If you think about some hunter-gatherer societies have a belief in religious spirits, but they don't do very much about it. If you ask them, I know this is true of the Hadza in Tanzania, for example. I've never studied them, but I have colleagues and friends who've been to the Hadza, and apparently if you say, what do you think about the ancestor gods? They'll say, I don't know. Do you believe they're around? I suppose so, but they're not a sort of daily presence. Similarly, I think the Druze of Lebanon, whom again I've not observed personally, but the Druze of Lebanon have lots of rituals and dressing up and so on, but they're a Shia movement. But I don't think they have anything in the way of very codified belief. Obviously, they're Muslim. They're a very undoctrinaire kind of Muslim movement. There are other movements which are extremely full of doctrine. And then there are ones that are like most forms of Judaism, where the doctrine is, interestingly, very complex and very specific, because there's a text and there are prohibitions in the text. So the doctrine has a strong moral and ritual component. But if you ask many Jews about the afterlife, they're not really sure. And there's no sort of common Jewish view about the afterlife. There are different Jewish scholars who have had different views about the afterlife. The whole rabbinical tradition has examined it one way or another, but there's no common Jewish doctrine about the afterlife. Quite unlike evangelical Christianity, which has a doctrine about the afterlife based on the Bible, but the Bible is inconsistent on these points. And so what one particular movement preaches about the afterlife on the basis of biblical literalism will be slightly different from what another movement preaches about the afterlife based on biblical literalism.
All right, so if you want to create a successful religion, you may want to have a doctrine, but it doesn't have to be framed in a way that will tell the believers everything and the whole truth, right? There is some freedom you can actually give them.
Yes, and we actually have historical laboratories where we've seen this. So in Germany in the 16th century, after the Reformation, we saw an enormous efflorescence of different religious movements like the Anabaptists and so on. And what was striking about them is that many of them set out in rebellion against what was thought of as the doctrinaire inflexibility of Catholicism. And yet, curiously, they produced doctrines which they sought to enforce with all the vigor and all the intolerance of the Catholic Church against which they were rebelling. And I discuss this in the book chapter on religion and politics, in which I say that the whole point about creating a new religious movement is that you may be in revolt against the unacceptable doctrines of some other movement, but you also want to create a unifying force for your members. And sometimes the most effective way of doing that is creating a new set of doctrines around that. And many of those movements that grew up in Germany in the 16th century had extremely elaborate and, from the point of view of secular scientific mind might think very arcane and complex and not very empirically credible sets of beliefs, but it was very important to demarcate themselves from the Catholic Church.
What about then the narrative? Because you do also dedicate a chapter to narrative. So do you have to have one? And if so, are there some common characteristics that we can extract from the study of all of those narratives, or is it also very diverse?
One of the things that I haven't mentioned so far, but is crucial to the discussion in the book of how religions have developed prehistorically and historically, is a distinction between what following others I call immanent religion and transcendent religion. And immanent religion is basically the kind of religion we're familiar with when we think about, say, ancient Greece and Rome. So you would go into the marketplace in ancient Rome or in Athens or even later in Hellenic Alexandria, and the marketplace was full of people offering all sorts of services that we would think of as religious. So they would be offering divination and astrology and spells and sacrifices that you could make. One of the things I liked most about the ancient Greek world was that they offered curse tablets, which were things you could buy if all of your sacrifices to make your life go well had failed, and you were being frustrated by somebody, your boss or an enemy or a rival for your wife's affections or whatever it was, you could just buy a curse tablet and that would put a curse on the person. And we have no idea whether those curses were effective. They probably weren't, but they made people a little bit more satisfied. So part of what happened in those cases was that the religion was starting to speak to people's sense of how difficult it is to live your life in a coherent way in a random and crazy and incomprehensible world. But we don't see, until the major world religions, the ones we call the transcendent religions, any kind of coherent overall vision which explains why the world is as it is and why your place in the world is as it is. For that, the Greeks had a separate profession, which was that of philosopher. And the philosophers, you could find them in the marketplace as well. But you wouldn't expect the same person who would allow you to perform a sacrifice to ensure that your business venture went well would then offer you a philosophy. You had to get the philosophy from somebody else. What was remarkable, I think, about initially Judaism, but also one or two other movements, including Zoroastrianism, that really came to the fore with Christianity and subsequently Islam, was that the same people who offered you the rituals and the sacrifices and the divination and the faith healing and all of that also offered you, as part of the package, a philosophical vision about how all of this fits together. It's not just that we offer you the curse tablets which enable you to express your frustration at the people who've caused you harm. We also offer you a story about how your harm fits into the bigger picture. I start the chapter on narrative with the assassination of the grandson of the prophet in Karbala in present-day Iraq. And I say that from a historical point of view, one of the weirdest things about this assassination is that it was the founding myth of an extraordinarily successful movement, which is Shia Islam, and has about 10% of the Muslims in the world belong to one or other current of Shia Islam. And from the point of view of previous history, the thing that religion was not was a celebration of the inspirational qualities of losers. If you lost, you were out. You might, as in the cult of Osiris in Egypt, come back because, in his case, the sister was able to find the body and bring him back to life and so on. But what Osiris was celebrated for was overcoming death, but he wasn't celebrated for being sacrificed. Whereas the death of the prophet's grandson is actually the founding, motivating myth of Shia Islam, just as the death of the founder is the founding and motivating myth of Christianity. And in a different way, Judaism has made out of the sufferings in Egypt and the exile in Babylon, and subsequently, obviously, the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and the very, very long wanderings of the Jews across Europe and Africa until the creation of the State of Israel, a story of suffering which would eventually be vindicated by the return. And the return could be, in the case of Christianity, in some afterlife. It could be, in the case of Judaism, which doesn't really believe in an afterlife to the same extent. It could be actually by the creation of the physical place of return in Israel, which is still a place that many Jews outside Israel look to and are inspired by, even if they have no intention of actually going to live there. And so these narratives have been made more ambitious and all-encompassing by these big world religions. But so I wanted to suggest that human beings have a need for stories, but what these modern religions, the ones I call transcendent, and which use a model of business functioning, which we haven't yet talked about, which is the model of a platform, actually have used narrative for new purposes, for bringing together a whole community in a kind of one-stop shop of all of the things that the religion can offer. And that was very unlike what happened in traditional immanent religion. So if you had a animist religion in Africa and parts of Latin America, you might go to the shrine and you would make a sacrifice. And that was a fairly transactional thing in which you made a sacrifice to some spirit, and the spirit in return was supposed to provide you with something. It could be success in a business venture. It could be a cure for your back pain or whatever it might be. But that was it. And so it was transaction by transaction. The narrative is a kind of thing that weaves together all of the different religious activities and tries to make sense of them collectively.
Two things. First, the curse tablet. I'm willing to put money on the table that if you start a business and start selling those, you will make a lot of money even today, right? I could see how popular this would be on social media. Now, the second thing is what we talked about so far is the offer side of it, right? So you may want to have doctrines, you may want to have rituals, a strong narrative may help. It's not a necessity, but in most of the successful religions. Now, you do also explore in the book more of the demand side of it, which relates to all of us, the believers and non-believers. And you actually explain that religions have benefited from our brain development over time. And you propose a Darwinian explanation for it. If you could unpack that for us, that would be very helpful.
Okay, first thing to say is I don't think there's such a thing as a religiosity trait. When I started doing this research, I was intrigued by what religiosity might be as a psychological phenomenon. And I assumed that meant that there was some module in the brain that made people religious, and it had a particular characteristic, and I was very curious to try and find out what it was. I've now become convinced there's no such thing. Now, as so often when you do research on these topics, you think you're inventing the wheel, and in fact you discovered somebody invented it before you. William James, in his Varieties of Religious Experience, which is a book whose title contains almost everything I've been saying so far, actually says it's a mistake to think that there's such a thing as religious awe or religious fear or religious love. What he says is it's actually normal human awe applied to a religious object, or normal human love applied to a religious object, or normal human fear applied to a religious object. Which is to say, there is religiosity, but religiosity isn't a single trait. It's a bundle of traits applied to the very diverse sets of objects that religious activity encompasses. Okay? Why is that important? It's important because We don't need to explain the evolution of a specifically religious thing in the brain or a part of the brain which is specifically adapted for religion. What we need to explain is something subtly different, which is, why is it in many but not all people that the attributes of the expressions of fear, love, awe, and so on come to be applied to objects we cannot see, taste, or touch? Okay, and that's a very different kind of question. In particular, I say in the book that it's a mistake to think that we might have a religious sensibility like people say have a physical eye, which allows them to perceive light and objects in their surroundings. And there's a very simple argument for why that can't be the right analogy, because we know that people who lack a physical eye are severely handicapped in the world. Okay, and we see the eye pretty well everywhere among all species that live in the light, except a few things like fish that live in very dark caves. So we know that not having an eye is a big disadvantage. There is no such thing to be said about a religious sensibility. In most societies, quite a few people are religious, but a fair number of people are not. And except for persecution by their fellows, they face no significant handicap. If you're not religious, you can live life perfectly easily, unless a bunch of other people decide to burn you at the stake or to kill you for being a heretic in some other gruesome way. So what that tells us is that we know that the physical eye, the ability to see light and to process it, has evolved many times in prehistory, and that eyes exist in different ways in insects and in mammals and vertebrates and so forth. And we know why that is. It's because the ability to perceive light is really adaptive for you. There is no such adaptive advantage to be had from perceiving invisible spirits. There are a lot of adaptive advantages from making an attempt to find out what your society expects you to do, including maybe saying that you believe in invisible spirits, but actually perceiving them doesn't give you any systematic adaptive advantage. What is important, though, is to explain why in almost every society we know, and I think I would actually say in every society we know, until proof of the contrary, people have been able to apply their faculties of emotional response, fear, awe, love, etc., to spirits that they cannot see, taste, or touch. Why is it that inability to see, taste, or touch the spirits has not been a major disadvantage? Why is it not a crucial objection to religious movements? And the short answer is that it's not actually very disadvantageous. So it's neither very advantageous nor very disadvantageous, because what most of the religious movements have done is channeled that in a way that brings people together, that allows them to benefit from community. And it's sometimes costly. It requires people like that young woman in Ghana to give 10% of her income to the church, but she gets a lot of benefit out of that. And a lot of what I described there is that she gets a benefit in return. And in prehistory, there's no reason to think that the sacrifices people had to make for their religious beliefs were very great. They became greater only with hierarchical religions, as in, say, Babylonia and Assyria and so on, where a priestly caste would actually extract a lot of resources from a population. But then what they did was to enforce that extraction of resources from the population by a number of gruesome practices like human sacrifice. And it was very clear that from the point of view of the individuals, they might as well do what they were being told to do, because otherwise they would be killed. So there's no period in prehistory in which it was actually very costly to hold religious beliefs. So in some sense, there's no real puzzle to explain.
And you do explain that US politics, for instance, they have to, on the contrary, say that they are religious, right? It would be very hard for them maybe to get elected if they were to say that they were not into any religions. But all of that brings us to the business models of those religions. And you do mention that the believers get something in return. So in a sense, you have two sides or maybe more. They are interacting through the church or the place where they go, the temple or whatever the form may take, which plays the role of a platform. And that's one of the strong claims of the book, which is that religions are platforms, and you draw comparisons with social media and nightclubs. So can you please explain who the different users or side of the platforms are, and which side of the platform do you need to grow first in order to attract the other side of that platform?
Okay, so we need to think that religious movements start for a whole lot of different reasons. There's no one canonical type of religious founder. I talk in the book about the huge number of motivations that religious founders have had for founding their movements. It can be a spiritual vision. It can be the desire to help the poor and downtrodden. It can be the desire to have access to sexually accessible females. It can be the desire to do something with their lives. I gave the example of a number of founders who have basically moved into running religious movements because other projects in their lives have failed for one or another reason. So there's nothing intrinsic about the motivations of religious leaders, and most of the religious movements that have ever been founded have disappeared without trace. So we're looking at essentially what are the characteristics of those religious movements that survive. And so whatever the motives of the founders were, the ones that survived are the ones that managed to create community. But sometimes community is a very tiny thing. So there are many roadside shrines, and throughout most of antiquity, there were little shrines by the roadside where travelers might stop, say a prayer, make a sacrifice, and put a little bit of money. And the person who maintained the shrine would put a little bit of investment of resources and effort and so on, but the investment wasn't very large and the return wasn't very large either. Once we start thinking about modern large-scale religious movements, you have to, first of all, have a ritual activity that is attractive enough to bring people together. But then what you have to do is to leverage that ritual activity so that people come not just for the ritual activity, they come for the other people that come for the religious activity. And so I give lots of examples. I give the fact that many religious movements are actually marriage markets. And it's very important to emphasize this. They're not just marriage markets. You know, if you come to a church, synagogue, whatever, in the hope that this might improve your marriage prospects, you're not doing that to meet people who just come to the church, synagogue, and mosque to improve their marriage prospects. And obviously think about the sexual segregation in a mosque or in many synagogues. They're not actually dating in confines of the religious service, but what they're doing is they're becoming visible. In the case of the mosque, what would happen is obviously men and women would not make contact through their presence in the mosque, but what would happen is that the different mothers of sons and daughters will talk to each other maybe after prayers. The fathers will exchange views about your son seems to be a very pious young man. He comes to the mosque very regularly. We see him there, and what are his prospects? And actually, I have a niece, and it seems to me that my niece might be a good match for your son. And we're very encouraged by the fact that your son is so pious, because that is exactly the kind of young man that we would like for our niece. The different ways in which the marriage markets play out is obviously vary hugely according to the specifics of the movement. And I don't want to imply that they're entirely uniform, nor do I want to imply that the marriage motivation is a main one. It's an important one, but people also come to find friends. They also come to find business partners. They come just sometimes for the pleasure of being able to talk to others before, after the service, or sometimes even during the service. And the people who run the ritual activities are very good at providing a package of activities around that. This was already visible in the Jewish synagogues well before the Common Era. We have evidence from several hundred years BC that Jewish synagogues provided education services, and they provided various kinds of community activities that are not precisely religious, but are ones that people would come to a synagogue because they knew that even if their children could get some kind of education elsewhere, they would get a better education from the synagogue, and they would be in better company in the synagogue than they would otherwise get. And for example, even today, I think that there's a lot of fuss being made about how the generation who are under 30 have turned away from religion. But one of the things we forget is that the people who turned teenagers in the year that the iPhone was launched, which is 2007, are essentially just reaching their 30s now. Okay. And these are people who have spent their 20s mixing and matching with everything on social media. They do their dating through dating apps. They order their food through Deliveroo and so forth. They do a lot of their work on work platforms and so on. And similarly, their religion has been pretty mix and match. They spend much less time in churches and mosques and synagogues. They get much more into sort of spirituality of various different kinds. But once they hit their 30s, start having children, a lot of them are going to say, actually, we really want to have a community where we can take our children, where we're going to find like-minded people, and where our children can grow up with the kind of values and the kind of community that we think is important for us. And so I strongly predict a return to religion by that smart social media generation as they start having children themselves.
So it is indeed a multi-sided market or platform. Now, you make a statement in a book that religions have moved the platform component of their operation to center stage. So what do you mean by that? Is it playing more of a role today than what used to be the case, let's say, 100 years ago?
I don't think 100 years is the right length of time to think about this, because 100 years ago was still well into the Industrial Revolution for many countries. I think the simplest way to think about it is through urbanization. Basically, what urbanization changes is that you don't have your community around you, you have to make it. Okay, so you grow up in a rural village, and most of the people in your village are people that you have known for a long time. So the community exists through the village community. Now, community is very important for you, but it doesn't play a platform role, because the whole point about a platform is that it creates relationships which would not otherwise be possible. So when you come together in a village where everybody knows each other and you perform, say, a spring festival for some kind of local god of the forest or of the riverside, then it's maybe a joyous occasion. Everybody's there together and you do find out something about each other, but it's mostly a celebration of being with people you already know. It's not about a way to meet up with and get to know people you otherwise wouldn't know. That completely changes when you come to the city. So you may come to the city from the countryside, and we've seen this happen all over the world. You don't necessarily repudiate the religious beliefs of your ancestors. And indeed, when you go back to visit your parents in the village, you may well continue to follow the same rituals and the same festivals and so on. But at the same time, you badly need some way of creating a community in the city. And that's what most of the big religions do, and they do so on a large scale. So I spend a lot of time in the book talking about Pentecostal and evangelical churches in Africa, but also in Latin America, Asia, and so forth. And what they do is they offer a set of activities which are based around community for people who have come to the city and are otherwise pretty lost. And so that means friends, business acquaintances, potential marriage partners. It means access to medical services. It means access to education, lots of things. And there aren't really many secular rivals for that. I quote David Parkin, the anthropologist who's done a lot of work in Tanzania, saying that actually on the roads coming into Dar es Salaam, you can actually see the different communities have set up their stalls. They'll maybe a mosque will have a little stall by the side of the road, and as people come in to Dar es Salaam from the countryside, they'll say, good to see you here, and maybe you'd like to come along to the mosque, and maybe you'd like to come and have a talk to some of our people and give you a cup of mint tea, and you can get to know our community. And of course, none of this is about doctrine at this point. None of this is about the sort of hard side of religion. It's about come and find a community. But the same people may see on the other side of the street a little stall set up by a local Pentecostal church, and the Pentecostal church says, come and check us out, and you'll see we have a nice, lively community, and of course it's no obligation, and you can just come and see what you like, and you'll find that there are lots of people like you, and not just people like you. And this is the important point. It's not just the like-minded, it's also there are people like you who've come from the countryside and are a bit lost, but also there are people who might be able to offer you a job. So this is where the platform side and the diversity of the community that comes in. It's not just lots of people who are currently unemployed and are looking for a job, but it's also senior business leaders who are able to offer a job. And it's not just footloose migrant young men who don't know any young women, but it's also some women of good family who might be interested in a young man who can demarcate himself by his piety, by his seriousness, by his willingness to turn up on a regular basis, looking sober and serious, to show that he's a potentially worthwhile marriage partner.
Yeah, you do explore in the book those dynamics and the fact that you don't have necessarily similar people in a church or a temple or synagogue or mosque. You may have all sorts of people, including those who may offer you a job. But you do also explain the fact that because you're going to be in touch with those people a lot, you may be tempted to look for a church or a place where people are not too diverse in this sense. So far, we've explained that you need a ritual, or at least it may help, doctrine, strong narrative, and on top of that, you want to offer a package, right? So this is the platform part of it. But even though you may have all of that, it's not a guarantee that your religion will actually succeed and will conquer the world. So that leads us to part 2 of the conversation. How do you scale a religion? And on page 50, you explain that today's dominant religions are scaling and actually gaining market share compared to small religions, let's say, over the last 50 years or so. So I want to talk about that and how do one scale a religion and make it indeed successful. You write that today's successful religions are like franchises in an economic sense. They do combine centralized and decentralized control, which is a necessity because they could not control billions of people. So could you please explain how it works in practice?
Okay, again, it works in a diverse set of ways. The Catholic Church is actually pretty unusual in the sense that it does have a boss, and it has a boss of 1.3 billion people. And as I point out in the book, paradoxically, lots of people think that the Catholic Church, because of the presence of this boss, is a very hierarchical religion. But in lots of ways, that's just wrong. The Catholic Church has an astonishingly flat hierarchy for such a large organization. It basically has 4 layers: the individual believer, the priest, the bishop, and the pope. Now, there is a much more complex set of status hierarchies. So there are cardinals, for example, who are senior to bishops. But the cardinals are not so much part of the authority hierarchy of the church. They're part of the status hierarchy, and the cardinals are formally the advisors to the Pope rather than the bosses of the bishops. And it's the bishops who essentially are answerable to the Pope and are responsible for overseeing the parish priests, and the parish priests overseeing the individual members. Now, that very flat hierarchy means that the leadership of the church does not have and has never had the bandwidth to monitor in detail what goes on at the lower levels. And therein lies, in a sense, the whole sad story of abuse in the Catholic Church, which we may want to come back to later, but I won't get into now. But basically, it says that the abuse is not the result of bad people. Clearly, bad people do commit abuse, but the fact that abuse is so systematic within an organization like this has to do with its structural characteristics. Now, that's one and rather unusual model of how the religious franchise system works. The franchise system that's much more common is the one in Protestant Christianity or in Islam, where essentially the franchise does not work because the movement has a boss who can hire and fire and excommunicate recalcitrant leaders at the lower levels. They try all the time. Famously, of course, Islamic clerics try to excommunicate each other through fatwas at frequent rate. But the fact that they use so frequently shows us that excommunication plays a very different role in Islam from what it does in Catholic Christianity. In Islam, basically anybody can set up as an imam. Clearly, if they are lucky enough to be appointed imam to a mosque that has a history and a set of impressive buildings, and if they can leverage their association with an existing a mosque, then they have a great deal of authority, which is not just through their teaching. But anybody can become an imam. You can set up a mosque in a garage somewhere. You can start preaching. You can attract your followers in just the same way as you can become a Protestant preacher. You see this all through the cities of the developing world, but also not just the developing world. You see it in many US city and country areas. You can be driving through a small town in the American Midwest, and there'll be a little sign saying New Testament Church of God, and it's a little hut somewhere, and it's some preacher who has a following on Sundays and sometimes during the week as well. And in a way, the franchise is a little bit like the restaurant business, but not in the precise way that a branch of McDonald's has to follow a very exact set of rules in order to be considered a branch of McDonald's, and has to be approved by McDonald's. And usually the people have to undergo some training in order to be entitled to be a franchisee of McDonald's, and they have to have a very precise logo and so on. In the case of most Protestant Christian churches, the link between the world movement and the individual churches is looser. There are some genuine franchises like the Assemblies of God, which was founded in the US and now has spread across the world. But even there, the link between the home movements of the Assemblies of God and the ones in other countries is looser than, say, the link between a McDonald's restaurant and the McDonald's HQ. And of course, if you're just a preacher with your own church called the New Testament Church of God in some rural town in Louisiana, then your claim to be a Christian church is based on your using the Bible. And so just as in the case of Islam, the Quran is the coordinating mechanism which allows all of the different people who set up their own mosques to claim that they are Muslims. Similarly, the Bible is the mechanism, it's the technology, as it were, that allows all of these people to say that they're Christians. But clearly, the way they interpret the Quran is going to vary enormously from one mosque to another. If you're a Sufi, then you will emphasize the mystical parts of the Quran. If you're a Wahhabi, you might emphasize the doctrinally demanding parts of the Quran. And if you're a jihadi movement, you may well emphasize the more martial parts of the Quran. The Quran has martial parts as well as peaceful parts, as well as mystical parts, just as the Bible does. The Bible has some very martial parts of it, which will be celebrated by some Christian communities and ignored by others.
So to some extent, you may want to give more freedom to your franchisees than what you will see in the McDonald's franchise. That will be one part of you being able to scale the religion. But on the other end, you also need to be able to grow without strong decreases in your believers. And you do suggest that actually the relationships between the members of a religion are very strong. And you do cite some empirical research to support that. On top of which, that typically religions do not allow for multi-homing. Not true for all of them, but which reinforces the lock-in effect. Does it mean that religious market shares are robust to the point where you do see little variation in time? And if so, it would seem to suggest that religions are quite different from online platforms, for instance, because they are sensible to fashions and trends. For example, Facebook today is no longer fashionable. TikTok is and soon won't be. But Christianity and Islam and the others that we've been discussing today have been around for centuries. So what do you make of that contrast? And does it mean that religious market share are more robust than any others?
Yes, I think they are more robust, but there's a lot of churning that goes on within them all the same. So you can see this, for example, in the US, where even though there has been a decline in the proportion of the American population that declares itself to be a member of a specific religious community. So if you look at data from, say, 2000 to 2020, you see a substantial decline of several percentage points in the share of Americans who say they actually belong to a given church. It's mostly churches. There are a few mosques and temples and so on as well. Yet, in spite of that, the probability that a given American belongs to a mega church has actually increased over that time, again, by a few percentage points. And so what that shows is that you're getting an increasing willingness of those Americans who do want to belong to a church to belong to a large church that creates a kind of ambitious community. It's not just that the physical church will be large. So many of these churches may host several thousand people in the same building on any given Sunday, but it's large in a different sense. It's large in the sense that it has a whole team of assistant pastors who are then supplying a great range of services. They're supplying Bible study groups, they're supplying youth groups, they're supplying babysitting, they're supplying sports clubs for the weekend, they're supplying mental health support groups, they're supplying kitchens, they're supplying all sorts of things that help with health difficulties and so on. And more Americans are looking to the megachurch model. It's still a minority. It's about, I would say, 14 or 15% of the US population belongs to a megachurch, out of, say, a total of 70% that belong to some kind of church. But on the other hand, it's gone up from about 11% 15 or 20 years ago. And that's quite a big change. So you've got to change within the Christian population in terms of the kind of things they're looking for. And I predict that when the generation that grew up with social media comes to enter their 30s and starts having children in significant numbers, then they're going to want to come back from what has been for the last decade and a half a very mix and match and rather disengaged form of spirituality. So I think that what's going on is some churn, but as you say, a lot of stability. And it's not an accident, because if you take the analogy with social media again, what I think religions are offering is a very attractive form of offline platform that actually draws a lot on the technologies of online movement. So a lot of these big mega churches, like a lot of big mosques in many parts of the developing world, are using social media to engage and motivate people. So they're using modern techniques, but the whole point is they're using social media as a complement to, rather than a substitute for, physical community presence. And I think that's one of the great stabilizing features of these community movements, that they understand about social media, they understand about online engagement, but they use online engagement as a portal to strengthen physical presence. And that's why no imam anywhere will ever say to you, it's perfectly okay to be a good Muslim purely online. You have to come to the mosque, okay? And if you don't come to the mosque every Friday, you're not a good Muslim, which, of course, lots of Muslims don't. In many countries, Iran, for example, where the political regime has exploited Islam shamelessly, mosque attendance is down to about 40% of the population per month, which, so let's say only 40% of the Iranian population actually attend a mosque service even as infrequently as once a month. The great majority of Muslims are not attending the mosque every Friday, but the imams are still telling them you have to come. There is no real market for a purely online version of Islam.
Let me follow up on that, and more specifically on the interplay between technology and religions. You do make a prediction that the social media generation will, in a couple of years, go back to those offline meetings. And actually, in the conclusion of the book, you make a very interesting point that some technologies change the scale at which social organizations can operate, which also impact religions. The printing press is a classic example, but other than the printing press and social media, which technologies, in your view, have had the biggest impact on the scaling of religions so far?
The printing press is the most obvious example because of the way that it made it possible to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church and to create an opening for massive entry into the religion market by a wide array of Protestant movements. But you can go back beyond that. So in some sense, the Catholic Church enjoyed the scale it did because of the Roman Empire. So you can say that it was a combination of Roman roads and the Roman military model that made the Catholic Church possible. Obviously not until the conversion of Constantine, because the Catholic Church only achieved its scale when it managed to conquer the political governance of the Roman Empire. But even before, in the 3 centuries or so before the conversion of Constantine, what the Christian Church was able to do was to use the scale of the Roman Empire to make converts, specifically appealing to the poor and the downtrodden of the Roman Empire. I talk in the book about how the early Christian converts were disproportionately women, the poor, and slaves. It wasn't so appealing to the upper class of the Roman Empire. And it would not have been able to do that had the Roman Empire itself not had this huge technological advantage based on roads, ships, forms of communication, which meant that messages from this previously small cult in Palestine were able to be sent out to the 4 corners of the Roman Empire in short order. But then, of course, the big technological change, as I say, was printing in the 15th century. And a number of other things, including improved shipping, meant that you could have the Jesuit order, which was then able to send missionaries out to very far-flung places, as far-flung as Paraguay and China. That was possible because communications were improving. The proportion of ships that were lost was going down. The length of the journeys that you took to get to China or to get to the Americas was shortening. So in Marcus Friedrich's History of the Jesuits, there's a whole lot of stuff about Jesuit communication strategies. They sent 3 copies of every letter because they knew that many of them were going to be lost. But during the 17th century, the shipping technology was improving so that the proportion of letters that was lost was smaller. They were getting there faster. So the Jesuit order could start to manage its activities across the world much more efficiently than would ever have been possible before. So what we're seeing with social media is an incredibly sped up and accelerated version of changes which have been going on for centuries, mainly to do with falling costs of communication, improved reliability of communication, and that's just as important, and improved ability for people to interpret communication in their own way. So the printing press was important, not just because it sent the message more reliably to what was in the Bible, for example, to the communities who were able to have access to the books, but also that the individual communities were able to interpret the message more reliably. So under the old Catholic Church system, before the invention of the printing press, essentially it wasn't just that it was slower and more unreliable to get the Bible to people, but the Bible had to be interpreted by somebody who would speak Latin, which essentially meant a priest. And therefore, there was really very little that a recipient community could do with that message if it wasn't already interpreted by somebody who was mandated by the Catholic Church. Once you could translate the Bible into the vernacular, then you didn't need the mandate of somebody who was authorized by the Catholic Church. You could set up your own church.
So now we know what's the perfect formula for creating and scaling a religion. And I would like to take you outside of the 14 chapters of the book and to see if we can extrapolate from your work. So this is part 3 about the new religion with a question mark. Let me see if what we see in the Silicon Valley could be qualified as religion or religious movements. And I'll make it concrete with 2 examples, starting with the Californian ideology that appeared in the 60s. It seems to me that if we were to fit that ideology into your framework, we would see that the ideology behind is actually to promote access to tools in order to free people. So this is very much what people now call the tech solutionism. There is a strong belief in decentralization, which led actually to pretty good policy, Linux, blockchain, and so on and so forth. We see rituals. Think of hackathons, product launches, TED Talks, meditation apps, digital detox retreats. All of that is somehow emerging out of that ideology. Burning Man is also a very good example of it. The doctrine seems to me to be pretty clear. It is, in a sense, telling us that technology will liberate us, that decentralization is inherently good, code is law, progress is exponential, and so on and so forth. And lastly, the Californian ideology tell us a powerful story starting in a garage, or in that case, in a van, with individual geniuses such as Stuart Brand that actually came and disrupted the stagnant system. And today we have also the scent of the Californian ideology. That would be Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. We have the heretics. This will be the people calling for regulation. The apocalypse is coming. That's the AI doom, the climate collapse. And we have salvations. Those are blockchains, AGI, living on Mars, and so on and so forth. Does it look like a religion to you?
Yeah, it does in lots of ways. As I think I emphasized maybe before we started recording, I'm not interested in what is authentic religion or not. After the Reformation, there was immense argument between the Catholics and various flavors of Protestantism about which of them was authentic and which wasn't. Often what one group would say about the other is not just we don't like what this group does, but what they are doing is not religion. It is paganism, it is this or it is that. I don't think it's particularly fruitful to argue as to whether the package of phenomena that you describe really is or isn't religion. It may be, my definition turns on whether there are invisible spirits that are invoked in these activities and that intervene causally in the world and are susceptible to our entreaties. And I think some people in the Silicon Valley ecosystem that you described do believe that. So there's a very high level of spirituality in Silicon Valley. And indeed, there's a book called Work, Pray, Code by Carolyn Chen, who's a sociologist at Berkeley, who looks at loosely Buddhist ideologies in Silicon Valley and how Buddhist and quasi-Buddhist movements have attracted people in Silicon Valley. And so it's clear that there are many people who belong to the kind of set that you'll describe who would have directly spiritual beliefs and who would therefore believe that some version of an invisible spirit that matches my description. Others would say, no, we're absolutely secular, but you probably, if you think about things like cryogenics and various forms of belief in a future of human intelligence that's instantiated other than our brains, are starting to think about things that look a little bit like invisible spirits. So I'm just not particularly invested in, is this actually religion or not? That seems to me a definitional or theological dispute. It's very like religion. It's also very the highly decentralized and somewhat anarchic forms of religion. So I would expect a lot of those movements to fizzle and die, not because there's anything wrong with them, but because that's just what happened, for example, after the Reformation, when the fall in communication costs just led to an enormous amount of new market entry. Lots of these movements started up. Most of them didn't survive the deaths of their founders. But on the other hand, you mentioned rituals. You didn't mention important moral codes. So whether it's the popularity of polyamory in the Silicon Valley ecosystem, it's clear that a lot of people in the Silicon Valley ecosystem you describe have strong views about how you should conduct your sexual life. They're not the traditional Christian ones, but they're just as, it would be very difficult, I think, in certain kinds of Silicon Valley circles to say that you're not comfortable with, say, non-binary genders because you feel more comfortable in a binary thing. That's not I don't have that particular view, but I can imagine that in certain circles which would be more polyamorous and more open to gender fluidity, somebody who was uncomfortable with those lack of definitions might well be considered actually not just not an appropriate member of our group, but as actually having a rather deficient form of sexual ethics. So I think that there's a lot that's in common with communities who have strong prescriptions about how you should live your lives. And that's what we see in the Californian and Silicon Valley ecosystem as well. So I think it meets a lot of the criteria for being a religion, but it's rather novel, just as many religions in the Reformation were novel. And I'm personally not particularly hung up as to whether we call it a religion or not. It's certainly new and interesting, fascinating even, and I look forward to seeing how it develops.
Let me take a second example and ask a different question that is related to what you said in conclusion. And that example will be the one of effective altruism.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the rituals, they have their own set of structured communal practices, annual conferences, that's EA Global, donation pledges, like giving what we can, reading groups, and so on and so forth. When it comes to the doctrine, EA Effective Altruisms promote a set of doctrines in which the participants have to accept the idea of doing the most good possible on the planet, maximize impact. All lives are equally valuable. Suffering can be reduced through the use of reason and evidence and science. And when it comes to the narrative, it actually offers quite a powerful, coherent narrative. It tells the story of a world that is improvable, in which individuals armed with reason, evidence, and compassion can actually reduce suffering on a massive scale. There is sin, that's ineffective giving, selfish career choices, such as, by the way, being a doctor because you will only save 300 people in your life, when if you are working on Wall Street, make billions and give that, you will save way more. We see redemption and even prophets like Peter Singer and others. Again, not judging whether or not this is all good or crap. My question is this: looking at the evidence that you have in your book, can we forecast the chances of success of this one and others? Or is it something we can't do? It's too dependent on the specifics.
I think it's difficult to forecast its success. I'll come back to that question in a moment. I'd first of all push back a little bit further than I did in the Californian case on the description of this as a religion, because what I don't see is the invisible spirits aspect. In the case of Silicon Valley, I was suggesting that things like cryogenics and the instantiation of intelligence in silicon-based rather than carbon-based infrastructures was giving a bit more of a sense. Plus also the fact that there's much more penetration of, broadly speaking, Buddhist ideas, and the idea that, for example, meditation puts you in charge with some kind of world consciousness, which I think is more popular, as far as I understand it, in the kind of Californian ecosystem that you described than specifically in the effective altruism movement. I've never been to an effective altruism conference, so I don't know whether the rituals include making some kind of communication to future generations. Maybe future generations are invoked in the same solemn way that, say, Jehovah or Allah or Jesus are invoked in other traditions. I'm not familiar enough with it. But I think the fact that there are rituals, and just the fact that there are doctrines and requirements for people to live their lives in a right way, doesn't quite take it over the boundary of religion. But again, I'm not terribly interested in policing the boundary of religion. If somebody wants to say, well, it's effectively like religion, I'd say, fine, sure, I'm cool with that.
Yeah, sure. For tax exemptions, maybe you may want to make that point.
Can we say something about how successful it will be? Statistically, most religious movements do not survive the death of their founders. That's a very important consideration. Now, a small minority of religious movements have, and they're as diverse as Shia Islam and the Mormon Church, Christianity, and so forth. And it's not quite clear to me that effective altruism has anybody quite as charismatic as those founders. But again, the charisma is often attributed to the founder afterwards by the people who then launched the movement. We have no idea really how charismatic Jesus was. What we know was that a number of his disciples were immensely inspired by him. Saul of Tarsus then became the entrepreneur that created a story which got the Christian movement going. So the fact that somebody, say Peter Singer, who is clearly charismatic in a certain sense, but not, I would have thought, of a kind that after his death would be likely to continue to inspire people in the way that Jesus did. But maybe all he needs is his Saul of Tarsus to turn him. I hope he remains with us for many years longer. When he eventually shuffles off this mortal coil, I'm guessing that his works will continue to inspire people, but his person is unlikely to inspire people in the same way that the person of Muhammad or the person of Jesus continue to inspire them. And in the case of Judaism, which doesn't have a single founder, Abraham doesn't play the same role in Judaism that Jesus does in Christianity, Muhammad in the case of Islam. Judaism had the staying power it had because of the rabbinical tradition, which essentially brought what was originally a movement of people who were not more literate and not more strongly community based than many of the other populations in the Middle East in which they originally developed. Then, because of the catastrophe of the destruction of the temple and the scattering, the diaspora through the world, and the very strong determination of the Jewish rabbis to create communities that would last, they then developed something. And that wasn't based around a myth of an individual, but it was based around a very strong sense of identity, which kept people coming to the synagogues, kept them sending their children to be educated in the synagogues, and also was reinforced by the persecution, which meant that they were physically together in ghettos. I don't really see anything equivalent to effective altruism. So when the original founders of effective altruism are no longer with us, I don't quite see the same conditions that would keep the movement together and keep it focused. But I may be wrong, and who knows, maybe persecution under the Trump-Musk administration might give them the sort of cohesion and the identity which they need to become a religious movement on a large scale.
Talking about charisma, and to finish on a humoristic note, there is a great Curb Your Enthusiasm episode in which Larry David makes a point that if Jesus was actually a woman and was named Jane, then Christianity will be even more popular because people will be more willing to worship a woman than they are to worship a man. That makes me want to ask you a very final question. Is there something that amused you while doing the research? Something that you thought, actually, that's quite funny?
Oh, there were many things. Larry David doesn't have to speculate about this counterfactually. Go to Lourdes, and it's Bernadette who is being worshipped. Similarly, the Virgin Mary is worshipped, and the Catholic Church does not want to admit it. But basically, a lot of the veneration, according to the Virgin Mary, is not really easily distinguishable from the direct worship of gods in many other traditions around the world. So in some sense, Christianity was able to play it both ways. They had a man who, in many of the Christian traditions, is emphasized as having rather feminine qualities, being meek, mild, forgiving, and so on. Though we shouldn't forget that at other times in history, it's been the church militant, for example, during the Crusades, when Jesus was emphasized as bringing the sword. But as I described in my chapter on gender, it's interesting that even in the time of the Crusades, there was a whole genre of literature called the literature of the Weeping Crusader, which tried to emphasize that even people who were militant were actually tender-hearted. So I think that in some sense, this supposedly counterfactual speculation about Christianity has been tried, and it's worked. We don't have to speculate counterfactually, we see it. So yes, there were many things that amused me. I was very touched, as I mentioned in one of the chapters, about the way in which even incredibly busy Indian women in the villages I lived in would stop and make a pattern in rice flour in the dust outside their homes. It's called a koram in Tamil. And I was very amused by the fact that rather ponderously I'd read a piece of anthropology claiming that this was all a ritual in homage to the goddess Lakshmi, who's the goddess of prosperity, and so on. And when I explained this to the woman in whose house I was living, she just looked at me and say, "You've been overdosing on fancy intellectual stuff." She said, "I don't know what they've been telling you, but I do it because I think it looks beautiful." And that was bringing me down to earth, that I think we don't often need a fancy theological motivation for what people do. Sometimes just doing something because the gesture is right, because it's elegant, because it's beautiful. People need beauty and elegance and integrity in their lives. And in some sense, the more banal their lives, the more they need beauty and integrity and intelligence. And I think a lot of religious movements have been able to offer them that in a way that many secular businesses struggle to do. Many secular businesses try to give you something that is practical and useful and good for your bottom line, but stopping to think that we can offer you something that's elegant and has integrity is very important too. And the best religious movements have learned how to do that very effectively.
Paul, thank you so very much. I've learned a lot talking to you today, and also I truly enjoyed reading the book. It is by far the longest episode ever on the podcast, but we had so much ground to cover, and the book has actually way more. In 3 words, and I just put that on paper just a minute ago. When I think about the book, it's very elegant, and you just use that word, so it's a funny coincidence, but it's clearly very elegant writing. It's also empirical. You mention research and make references to the literature, which as an academic I of course very much enjoyed, and it's a page turner, which is not usually a characteristic that you would give to academic work. To everyone out there, get a copy of the book. It's called The Divine Economy. It's available everywhere, and I can make you a promise, which is that you will very much enjoy the experience. So to everyone out there, and to you, Paul, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.